Well, if you haven't looked at your calendars, this week is Easter coming up, so you're going to want to make sure that not only that you make it here next weekend, but that you pay attention a little bit to what's going on. We're going to do things a little bit different. First of all, we do want to have a Good Friday service, and we're going to do a few different things, so that should be enjoyable. We're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper together, and that will be at 6 o'clock Friday. So just something to be aware of. And then things will start off next Sunday morning at 9:30. You want to come a little early, and we'll go downstairs and have breakfast together. So we're looking forward to celebrating Easter together. Well, if you have been here for the last little while, then you know that we have been walking through Hebrews. We've been examining, some of what the author, the preacher, has been saying and delivering to the group of believers. Hopefully, if you were here last week, if you weren't, then you kind of get a pass. But if you were here last week, let me ask you this: will you'll remember that we talked a little bit about preparing, before we come into worship. About taking just a few minutes and, preparing our hearts, before we walk into a place like this to worship together. So much of of what the author of Hebrews has been laying out for us over these last weeks has been a reminder to the believers in his day of the elaborate and somewhat detailed requirements, in order to enter into the presence of God. And so let me ask, did you do anything different today, this week? Did you do anything differently before you walked in here this morning? I hope so. I hope that you have not only committed yourself to doing that, but that you have begun to practice that as well. But that got me thinking as I considered that this week and thought through, preparation for a Sunday morning. Do you suppose that it just might be that oftentimes when we come into places like this to worship, that we leave services like this exactly the same as we come in, because sometimes we have little to no expectations? That we walk in and we just assume that everything's going to be the same when we leave as when we came. And then I wonder, could it be that we have little to no expectations when we walk into a place like this to gather to worship because we haven't prepared it all, before we came in? And I wonder sometimes if we haven't prepared because, maybe we've never taken the time to learn. Maybe we've never taken the time to be trained, to go beyond the tradition and the repetition of Sundays in order to seek an encounter with the living God. That kind of starts us off on a light note, doesn't it, as we begin this morning? But the reason why we start there is this. I believe that underneath the currents of our day's culture, that there is a desire among the vast majority of people for something more. I believe that most people who may or may not gather on a Sunday morning as we are, I believe that there is a desire for something to go beyond just the dull repetition, from week to week to week. I think there's a desire for life. There's a desire for excitement. There's a desire for something better than what our world has to offer. And it doesn't matter where you look, whether it's on TV or social media or anywhere. There's a desire out there for something more. And that got me thinking about something else. See, that's a problem when you sit and you ponder some of these things. When you take the advice that the author of Hebrews has been giving us, to think about things, to consider things, to ponder them, to chew on them, well, it leads you down, this path. And sometimes it asks questions that, sometimes they're difficult questions. If you've been following along with us, in Hebrews, then, the question is this: why is it that if we have this better hope that the author speaks of, if we have living inside of us the very Spirit of the living God, if you were to go back to the beginning of Hebrews, you'll remember, you will see how he describes Jesus. And he says, if the one who is the heir of all things, if he is the one who would lead us into the very throne room of God, if the one who, according to the author of Hebrews, upholds, everything in our universe by the power of his very word, if the one who he describes as being greater than the angels, if the one who is greater than Moses, greater than the entire, system of the law, if he is the one who stands in the gap on our behalf, if he is the one that we have seen, that we'll talk about this morning, that we certainly will celebrate next week at Easter, if he is the one who has laid down his life as a ransom for ours, if he has brought about this new covenant, this better covenant, if he is the one that we gather to worship, if he is the one that we gather to praise, is that just a song that we sing? Are those just words that we repeat? If he is the one that we actually gather to praise, how is it possible that most of the churches that I have watched over the years look more like support groups than battalions of missionaries training to take on a world? Have you ever thought about that? How is that possible? And I thought about, how is it possible that for the, over 50 years that I have spent inside of churches and walked into services just like this, that sometimes it seems like all we do is just hit repeat. That all we do is just do the same thing that we've always done. And then I thought, well, how is it possible that when the first century opened, the beginning of our New Testaments, the beginning of all that transpired in the book of Acts, how is it possible that the very same religion, the very same ones who would worship the very same God that Moses went up on Mount Sinai and received the law from, the very one who Moses, stretched out his arms and his staff and parted the Red Sea, the very same one who sent plagues into Egypt that allowed them to be set free from slavery. How is it possible that these very same people who claim to serve the very same God, how is it possible that they could be filled with apathy? How is it possible that that their religious organization could be filled with corruption? How is it possible that the religious leaders of the day could be more concerned about their own welfare and their own wealth than they were about the spiritual condition of those around them? And yet that's exactly the condition of the people in the first century. And how is it that for so many who were outside of the power structure of that kind of a religious a system, desperately wanted something better, desperately wanted something more, but they didn't see it? They couldn't find it there. How is it possible that we live in a day and a time when the world around us is searching for something better, searching for something genuine, searching for something that is personal, that is real, searching for something better, and yet far too often they don't even see it in the very people who claim to hold it in our hearts and our hands. Do you ever wonder about those kind of things? These are the kind of things that keep me up at night. These are the kind of things that cause me to go down these rabbit holes and try and wrap my head around, how is this possible? And yet, It was to a group of people, not unlike this, that our author of Hebrews writes this message. A group of people who had tasted the excitement of Jesus. It was to a group of people who had undoubtedly felt the compassionate love of their Savior. It was to a group of people who had unmistakably seen, the activity of the risen Christ in their lives. It was to this group. And it was this group who had gotten so sidetracked, they had gotten so wound up in the troubles and challenges of their daily lives that they found themselves hanging on the edge of a cliff. Now, as we've highlighted along the way, that doesn't mean their struggles weren't real. It doesn't mean that their challenges weren't real. It doesn't mean that most of us walked into this room this morning with burdens that we carried with us, the challenges that we are facing in our lives. That's not the point. But you see, this group of believers that the author is writing to, they were thinking about jumping ship and going back to the way things were. They were thinking about going back to their repetitive ceremony and burdensome regulations. And in one way or another, our author has said something like this. You want to go back to that? That's why he kept pointing them back. That's why he kept highlighting for them, where they had come from. That's what our message has been asking them and us, and encouraging them and us to instead fix our eyes on something better. Fix our eyes on Jesus. That's what the author's been saying. That's what the message, not only to them, but to us. To fix our eyes on Him, and not only will the struggles and trials of this earth, grow dim, but we will begin to taste and see the joy of the Lord. In fact, I think God set before them, and I believe He is setting before us today, even through the message of Hebrews, the very same choice that He laid before His people thousands of years ago when Moses stood on a mountainside and declared before all of Israel. He stood there and said to them, "Today I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live, that you may love the Lord your God, that you may obey His voice, and that you may cling to Him, for He is life." Why does the author do this? Why does he keep coming back to this? Why does he keep pointing them to something better? Well, if you were here last week in the first part of chapter 9, where we were in Hebrews, he reminds us again of the limitations of the old covenant. He points us back towards a time when the high priest, when he could only once a year step into the presence of God. Remember that? We talked a little of the sacrificial system and the process that would happen. And after leaving us with the reality that this old covenant was just not good enough, because the day after, even the Day of Atonement, they found themselves right back where they were before. And this is what he says. He says, "But Christ." In chapter 9 and verse 11, he says, "But Christ." And everything changes. He says, "But Christ." And then he lays out a new perspective. But Christ. And then he lays out not just a new perspective, but he lays out the very purpose for which he came. And tied with that is the very purpose for which he created you and I. So let me begin to read some of this. In verse 11, he continues and he says this: "But Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is not of this creation. Not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? And for this reason, he is the mediator of the new covenant, by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. But Christ, he says, very powerful words. And with those words, everything changes. I mean, think of the contrast that he makes here, where the old covenant restricted access to the presence of God, where only once a year, only one guy could walk into the presence of God. There is a better covenant. There is a better way. And this better covenant offers unlimited access to the presence of the living God. Where the old covenant, covered sin temporarily. Remember that? Even the Day of Atonement, when the high priest went in and offered a sacrifice for the sin of the people, the very next day that sin, the stain of sin, returned. There is a better covenant, the author tells us, a better covenant that removes sin as far as the east is from the west. Does that mean that he takes the sin and somehow sticks it on two ends of a map? No, that's not the point, right? The point is that he, as far as we could possibly imagine, that is how far he removes sin. It doesn't show up again the next day. It doesn't, rear up again as it did under the old covenant. Where the old covenant laid hands on bulls and goats and other sacrifices, he points us to a better covenant that lays our sin upon the only one who could handle it. Where the old covenant brought guilt and shame, there is a better covenant, a new covenant that brings grace. Grace bought by a better sacrifice. A better sacrifice. Have you noticed that the author of Hebrews, as he is preaching this message, as he writes it down for them, he loves comparisons, right? He loves to do this. He's done it from the very opening of his words. And now he says this. He says, if the blood of bulls and goats can cleanse the priests outwardly, if this is good enough to even purify the tabernacle and the sanctuary and all of the things in order to fulfill their duties, he says, how much more? And this is a classic argument of the first century. It's arguing from the lesser to the greater. In other words, if this little one is true, then this big one is absolutely true. And that's what he does here. He says, if those are true, if this blood will cover those things and cleanse those things, how much better would the effect of the blood of the sinless Son of God cleanse? You see, that's his point. You see, such a sacrifice is so much better. Why? Because it cleanses not only outwardly, not only ceremonially, but it cleanses inwardly, and it cleanses completely. This is what Jeremiah was pointing to, when he spoke of this new covenant. Remember, he reminded us of that back in chapter 8. Behold, he says, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. And the point of that is an internal cleansing, an internal transformation. You see, such a better sacrifice, though, brings more than a selfish end, than an end that just impacts us. You see, there's a broader purpose in the midst of all of this. And like so many, though, of God's people before us, if we never scratch below the surface, if we never dig just a little bit, if we never consider the things that we are reading, if we never chew on them a little bit, well, we never really will understand, I don't think, that this sacrifice, this better sacrifice, was for a greater purpose than we can imagine. You see, that means then that our salvation provided by this sacrifice is for a purpose as well. In other words, if you have been saved by the blood of Jesus Christ, if you have accepted His forgiveness for your sin and claimed His sacrifice as a ransom for your own life, then you have been saved for a purpose as well. Saved for a reason. Listen to what he says. I think sometimes we kind of skip over these things. At the end of verse 14, he says this, to cleanse you your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. To serve the living God. So that you can serve the living God. That's the point. That is a statement of purpose. That's a statement of what we are to do, of why God did what He did. Yes, it includes an eternal inheritance, and He reminds us of that. But it goes beyond that alone. So much of what we do, so much of our focus is focused just on ourselves, isn't it? It's focused just on what I get out of the deal. I'm going to go to heaven when I die. Now, I'm okay with that. Don't hear me wrong. But it's more than that. What does he say here? For the purpose to serve the living God. What does that mean? That means to, at the very least, it means to seek His will for our lives, right? It is to follow in His footsteps. I mean, it's the very definition of this word that we like to toss around and rarely follow, called discipleship. That means we follow Him. Well, where do we begin? Well, we at least begin with passages like this, where at the end of John, where Jesus says to His disciples, as the Father has sent me, so I am sending you. I think that's the best version of the Great Commission out there, because it's shorter, easier to remember, right? But we understand that, don't we? I mean, it's to follow in His footsteps. I mean, you remember when Jesus said to His disciples at another time, He said, the Son of Man came to give you eternal life when you die so that you can go to heaven. It doesn't say that, does it? What did Jesus say to them? He said, the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which is lost. But we make it all about us, don't we? I mean, we read passages, we read parables, and we read ourselves into them as though it's all about us. When half the time, it is about our purpose for which we were saved, our purpose for which we were created. Our purpose, our service is what? I mean, at the very basic level, it's to share this great news. It's to deliver the very same proclamation that the angel did, to the shepherds at Jesus' birth. It's to proclaim the message of Easter. It's to proclaim this better sacrifice. It's to be, as I like to say, a missionary people, a sent people, called for a purpose. I mean, what is a missionary if it's not somebody who lives on purpose? Yes, we send some to the very ends of the earth. We're getting ready to do that. Maybe not quite to the ends of the earth, but we're getting ready to send Tim and Brianna to Mexico, right? As missionaries. But too often we think that's it. For too many years, churches certainly across North America, have thought that our only obligation, is to pray and to give and to send missionaries somewhere else. When we have been called to this very task, we are to do this very thing right here. Does that mean we don't send others? Of course not. I'm hoping that we send dozens and dozens over the years to come to the far reaches of our world. But it's got to include us as well. For our purpose is not to send others. Our purpose is to be sent. It's to be the ones that God would send. Some of us He will send to Mexico, some to the other ends of the world. Most of us He will send to your neighbors, those who you go to school with, who you work with, to the very world in which we live today. So much more. Let me read a little more of this. In verse 16, he says this, for where there is a testament, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is in force after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives. Therefore, not even the first covenant was dedicated without blood. For when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and goats with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you." Then likewise he sprinkled with the blood the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry. And according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no remission or forgiveness. Now, what is he doing here? Well, he's kind of, going back, and he makes another comparison that he loves to do. In the language of a will, the author is helping us understand how such a better covenant, this better covenant, was enacted. And yet, again, in this comparison, he tells us that a will is brought into effect when? When somebody dies. Death is required before, it becomes effective. And like a will, this new covenant is sealed and its promises enacted with the spilling of blood. And so he reminds us of that. But let me go on, because if I don't read it, we'll end up missing it. The last part of this passage, let me read it for us. He says this: "Therefore, it was necessary that the copies of the things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Not that he should offer himself often, as the high priest enters the most holy place every year with the blood of another. He would then have had to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this the judgment, so Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time, apart from sin, for salvation." Now again, our author has poured so much into these words and into this passage as well, more than we could ever cover in just a few minutes. But I want us to again remind us that when we read these passages, first of all, when we see this, doesn't it seem like God's got a plan in the midst of all of this? That he's headed somewhere? But you see, we won't see this if all we do is read little snippets and little parts and pieces. We only see this when we put the passage in its context. I might have mentioned that once before. It has to go in its context. In verse 23, I don't know how the Bible that you're looking at, the translation that you have reads, or how it lays it out, but mine, it's got a break, right? There's a break and there's a little heading that is right above verse 23. And it says this: "Therefore, it was necessary that the copies of the things, in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with a better sacrifice than these." Now, I know what happens, because I do the same thing myself sometimes. I know how we read our Bibles. And what happens is we come to this, and it's got this break, and it's got this heading, and we file it away thinking, oh, he's talking about something else. But it is an artificial break. He is not shifting gears. He's not changing subjects. Because the things that he's talking about that need this kind of cleansing are the things that he spoke up in the verse before. So can I encourage you, when you read your Bibles, read it. Read it in big chunks, not in little snippets. Don't read it for something you can post on your wall on a plaque. Read it to get the essence of what is God saying? What is the point of all of this? And then step back, and we'll do that in a minute, and put it in the context of the entire message. I can't imagine, well, actually I can, because I've gotten some interesting notes and emails over the years when somebody has just walked in or tuned in for just a little snippet in the middle of one of my messages, pulled it completely out of its context, and then tried to, use it against me. And it's like, seriously, read it in its context, hear it in its context, and we will see not only the heart of the author of this pastor who has such a heart for these people, but we will begin to see the plan and the heart of God in the midst of it. You see, it was the copy of things. Remember, we've heard that before over these last weeks. It was the copy of things that needed the blood of bulls and goats. But heaven, in the true sanctuary, in the true tabernacle, he says it himself, a better sacrifice is needed. A better sacrifice is required. You can't take the blood of bulls and goats and take them into the very throne room of God and think they're good enough. They aren't. That's the essence of what he's saying. But in the middle of all of this talk of sacrifice, of high priests, of entering the Holy of Holies, again, let me encourage you to step back and consider the big picture. You see, this is not a theological treatise or discourse on the identity of Christ. This is a sermon. This is a sermon that is meant to encourage. This is a message. Now, is there some information in there? Absolutely. We've been highlighting it for weeks and weeks now. Is there some great and, somewhat pretty cool information about who Jesus is? Absolutely. But at its core, this is a message intended to encourage, intended to challenge, intended to pull a disheartened group of believers back from the edge of a cliff. That's the point. And it's this purpose that underlines everything that the author has been pointing towards. That I believe that will ultimately reach into a struggling life, reach into a discouraged heart, reach into a life that is hanging on the edge of a cliff and bring us back. You see, this purpose that he has been laying the groundwork for, that he's been pointing us towards and holding out for us to grab a hold of. In essence, we could say it like this. He points us towards this better sacrifice that leads to a better result. A better result. So let me try and summarize all this because I'm going to run out of time. What he says here in this chapter. Christ did not enter a copy, but the real thing in heaven. And the real deal in heaven requires a more excellent sacrifice. Not one that is offered over and over again as the high priest did, when they entered the Holy of Holies on the, once each year. No, a better sacrifice. Because it's a sacrifice offered once for all time. And as the author brings some of this to a close, this section at least, he points us, I think, not only to the purpose of Jesus and why he came in the first place, but I think he points us towards our purpose as believers as well. In addition to serving the living God, he kind of builds on some of that. Well, first, Jesus appeared on this earth the first time for what purpose? To conquer sin and death, right? And on the cross of Calvary, as we will see and discuss a little bit of next Sunday, on Easter Sunday morning, he did just that. And I would say to us that we ought to live in light of that amazing, magnificent sacrifice. If we only did that, our lives would change. But he goes on and he says he will appear once more. This time, he will appear to enact salvation to its fullest. And what I believe the author would say to us this morning, what I believe God would say through him to each of us in this room this morning is this: we ought to live eagerly awaiting his return. We ought to live in light of that reality. Now, does that mean we should gather in rooms around tables and argue and talk about how the end times are going to play out? No, that is not the point. We ought to live our lives intentionally because of what is to come, based upon what he has already accomplished. You see, we should live in light of those realities. Yes, it means that that if his blood covers your life, then when he returns, and he points to it here a little bit, and we stand before him in judgment, his blood has already paid for our sin. It's like going up to the ticket counter and showing them your ticket, and it's already been paid. Already been paid. But it also means that we should live in light of that reality. Too many of us have spent too many years with that ticket in our pocket, stick it in our pocket, and we go home, put our feet up on our lazy boys, and we just sit there waiting for the end to come. That was not the point. That's not the purpose. We ought to live in light of that reality. I mean, are not the benefits that he has described, are they not beyond description? Beyond anything that we can comprehend? Better in every way, shape, and form possible. What better hope could we possibly have than to know that we are covered by the blood of Christ? That victory is already ours. Didn't we sing a song something like that? I've read the end of this book. I know what happens. We win. But too often, we don't live like that. We live as though, didn't we sing something about that too? We live as though we're immersed in a battle that we don't know what the outcome is. If you are a child of God covered by the blood of Christ, this better sacrifice, the battle's won. The victory is ours. So tell me this. How would your life be different if you lived in light of that victory? Now, my goal is not to downplay the challenges of our lives. My goal is not to say somehow, the difficulty that you are facing or the struggle that you have is in some way not that big. Not at all. I'm saying I know somebody bigger. And if we lived in light of that reality, I remember visiting with somebody over the course of several weeks who had horrific trauma, in her life. And I remember just encouraging her, when these thoughts come into your mind, when you start to feel oppressed over these things, just remind yourself of who you are. Pick up your Bible and read it. Think through the reality of what Jesus has done for you. Think about where you're headed when all of this is done, the rest that you will enjoy. And perspective will change. I know this firsthand. It changes everything. How would your life look if you lived it on purpose? And I'm not talking about, getting up, I got to go to work today and I got to do this. And I'm talking about living it in light of the purpose that God saved you for. Let me ask a completely different question. I know maybe some of you will think, well, that's a dumb question. What would happen if you lived like you really believed this stuff? Don't tell me we do. Because I've been doing this too long to be that naive. Because if we believed this stuff, if we believed, even a fraction of what the author of Hebrews has laid before us, if we believe that the one who has our back is the one who holds the entire universe by the power of his word, don't you think things would change? I'm pretty sure that most of us entered this place exactly the same as we did last week. I'd like to believe that, you listen to me every time I preach and do some of the things that I encourage you to do, but, I'm a realist. But can I say this? If you walked in here the same as you did last week, leave here differently. Leave differently because you serve one who is greater than all things. Leave differently because, as our author has told us, the one we serve is faithful. Leave differently because He is the one who offers us rest in the midst of the most difficult and I would say even horrific circumstances of our lives. Leave differently because you have something greater than religious tradition. And look forward to what God might do next week. Leave differently because you have a better hope that's based on a better plan, that leads us down a better way, that it has its roots in a better sacrifice. It's better. Leave differently because Jesus gave His life as a ransom for yours. I know what happens. I mean, you've heard me say this, right? I like the Lord of the Rings. It's a cool picture. It was a cool book before it was a cool movie. But I'm convinced every single one of us carries around a little ring that we hold so tightly. And when we go home and, we close the curtains and we sit down in our chairs and we pet our precious. And it's the struggles of our lives. It's the difficulties that we fixate on. It's the challenges, real stuff. But how is it possible that we keep going back to that? When the ruler of all creation says, just give it to me. Maybe we need somebody to come and bite it off. But anyways, that's a whole different, that's a whole different line. Can we leave differently? Because we are committed to living differently. And do you know what would happen? If we go all the way back to the beginning where we started this conversation this morning, what would happen if we left here differently? It's like those believers that the Apostle Peter wrote to. The world around us would look at the hope in our lives, and they would say to us, how can I get me some? How can you smile in the midst of difficulty? How can you have joy on your face in the midst of all the challenges that you're facing? Well, let me tell you who He is. You see, that's what makes it all better. Better than any religious tradition or repetition that we could find. Stand with me. Father, I do pray